mic set up tonight because Brendan's wearing a headset, so I look like the backing dancer. It's hard to see you, but my name is Lee Pennington. I'm one of the public programmers who's working on Plotting the Clearing. So this is talk 3 in a series of 7. And I'm just going to tell a little bit about the kind of background idea for a salon-style kind of talk. It historically comes from when women were excluded from institutions and the academy, so they would invite experts in to their living room so that they would get a talk informally and an education as well. So it's kind of an educational social event. So even though we're in the auditorium tonight and it feels maybe a little bit more at distance, we're still closer than we have been for 18 months. So at the end of Brendan's talk, there is an opportunity for conversation and for him to answer any of your questions, and I hope that you do. So I am really looking forward to introducing Brendan Walker, thrill engineer, who is also Professor of Creative Industries at Middlesex, for his talk on Folkestone through the eyes of a thrill engineer. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, actually, I was thinking, how do I start this talk? And actually, I remember it did have a title, didn't it? Folkestone through the eyes of a thrill engineer. So I mainly am going to look at Folkestone. This is when I was invited to give the talk. I don't know Folkestone very well. So I'm mainly intrigued by entertainment, engineering, innovation, and also entrepreneurship as well, and business. And I'm going to start with, well, actually, one of the first pictures I found of Folkestone. Of course, at the time, I didn't know that the pier wasn't here anymore, but we'll come on to that later. So, Folkestone, the pier. Now, the first thing that interested me in when I saw this picture was just down the coast, did a project with Hastings Pier. So, again, you know, just this idea of what do I bring when I'm looking at Folkestone, the kind of experiences I've had and the things I see that start to relate. And I think this talk's very much more about my process when I'm invited to maybe respond to a commission or look at new spaces. So I'll often look at the kind of work I've already done and think about these places. So Hastings Pier, when Hastings was being, the pier was being regenerated, the CEO at the time invited me to create a piece of public art which would celebrate the pier and also make people fall back in love with the pier. That was his, that was the brief. So this is how the pier looked back in 2010. I think this picture was taken. Now, as an engineer, and famously for Hastings, the piles of this structure were designed and built by Eugenius Birch. They were very specific, groundbreaking, literally, engineering feat to be able to dig down into the bedrock. And it was this structure, this skeletal structure that really intrigued me, and how it had weathered its place on the coast, you know, sticking out like a finger into the sea. A lot of my work, particularly as a thrill engineer and a ride designer, is very much about looking at the emotions that I can elicit in people who are riding my rides or watching my rides. And this painting by Turner, which is actually over the sea, and actually Lee just pointed out to me, you can see France. So this was actually in Calais, the port. This was the pier in Calais, I think the title is. And it shows the sea. Turner was very well known for being able to portray the sea and evoke emotions just by his portrayal of the surface. But also, if you get closer, you can see some of the mixed emotions of people on the boats, on the pier. Some look excited, some a little apprehensive, others incredibly fearful and scared. And it was this mixture of emotions and the relationship to the sea and also these engineering structures and craft that really fascinated me. Jumping forward into the 21st century, or actually maybe the latter of the 20th century, these large structures, these oil rigs started to appear, and there's a lot of science and engineering around how to make these structures withstand these very harsh environments, being stuck in salt water, the power of the waves. And I came across this formula, and I'm often intrigued by formulas. This is called Morrison's equation. And what it tells me is, when I actually found out what it meant, was you can tell the power of a wave just purely by inspecting the surface condition of the sea. So Turner was right that when we look at a painting of Turner's, we only have to look at the surface of the sea to know the power that sea has to transform, to make changes. And this is Morrison's equation. And it says if you can monitor the height of the waves and the frequency of the waves, you can work out the forces that are being applied to the piles, these supports holding up these giant structures out at sea. So the project at Hastings Pier started out very early on just as a laser sensor out on the structure. There was no power out on the pier. They ran power out for me. In fact, actually, we used solar power to start with. We had a laser pointer looking at the surface of the sea, and I just started generating streams of data, looking at the surface of the sea, the height of the sea, looking at the swell, looking at the smaller waves, the ripplets, looking at the really large waves, which is obviously the tide coming in and out over the day. And this data I started to use to drive, so we've got real-time data coming over the web. I started to explore the materiality of water and magnets, so making my own small sculptural studies, but also on the right, thinking about working with local schools and building kits that would enable other creative technology explorations of the data that I was starting to gather from the pier. The piece of work I finally realized, which was shown remotely in FACT in Liverpool, and it was really nice to see Mike Stubbs' work here, the Triennial, was a tea service. It was called Storm in a Teacup. And it really was based on my childhood memories of having very wet, damp holidays in Bridlington and having to sit in bed and breakfasts, looking out at the sea, very miserable. But this little tea service here was driven by the live data. So we had a bourbon biscuit, which was precariously dangling over a cup, and every 12 hours it would actually dissolve in the tea. Then we had a teaspoon, which was using the ripplets and the other waves animating the tea bag. And obviously offset against the backdrop of both the data and the sea was meant this installation that was devoid of people was supposed to evoke an emotional response in the viewers and again create a connection with Hastings Pier. Now, the CEO of that pier, a guy called Simon Opie, has also been popped up in my life earlier. He was the studio director for the Two Swords Group, which is now the Merlin Entertainment Group, who own Alton Towers, Chessington, Thorpe Park, Sea Life, many other brands, Legoland. And occasionally I'll go into companies like this and act as a consultant for new rides. So I worked on Wicker Man, for example, at Alton Towers, one of the last roller coasters that I helped in the early stages to create and design. But these rides, again, when I'm looking, and the kind of consultancy I do is often informed by old work that I can find, so old patents of rides and technology. And this one in particular has been around, I think, in my life for maybe the last 15 years. It was a description of in fact, actually, this came from a patent for a ride in 1894 called the haunted swing illusion. And what people do would be, so on the left-hand side, actually, let me tell you what happens. People go into a room. They think it looks like an ordinary room, much as you are in here today. You would climb inside a gondola. The gondola itself would start to swing backwards and forwards, so you'd see yourself moving, you'd feel the sensation. But the whole room itself is on a mechanical system, and the room would start to rotate in the opposite direction very subtly. And so you started to get this visual illusion of swinging much higher than you were in the real world. You had the sensation, but your eyes were creating this visual illusion. And it would create this sensation of goneness. This was how it was reported at the time. I think we call it motion sickness today. But it was very popular. In fact, at Alton Towers, they have a ride there called Hex, which is still based on this basic principle. Now, back in 2016, with the advent of virtual reality and some other earlier explorations I'd done of that technology, I was fascinated by the changing, undulating forces that you sense when you're just on a very simple playground swing. You have the sense of maybe about 20% more weight when you're at the bottom, and then when you fly it towards the top, you're about 20% lighter. So you have this changing forces on the body as you're powering the swing backwards and forwards. And virtual reality headsets have accelerometers inside them, so we can actually monitor these forces as we're swinging backwards and forwards. So using my engineering as part of my creative process, I started to deconstruct swings. And swings are actually more complex than you might imagine. Usually when you're doing O-level or A-level physics, you've got a very simple pendulum. But actually swings themselves are there's loads of change inside a swing, and they're quite complex. But the basic principle about these undulating forces, and a little bit like a metronome, if you set the distance of the weight below the pivot, there's a period, it's sort of, you get this rhythmic kind of beat going backwards and forwards. Now, this rhythmic beat, I was first interested, could I recreate the haunted swing illusion? And I was commissioned by Sight Gallery to produce a piece of work in 2017. This was called Oscillate, where I created a facsimile of the gallery space on the right-hand side, which, using the data I was gathering from the accelerometers, I was able to match pretty perfectly to the forces that the rider was sensing, but obviously then using, in the digital world now, this idea of over-rotating the room. But I didn't stop there. I thought, well, okay, that works so well. I thought, well, what other things create a sort of vertiginous experience? So then I started looking at techniques that Hitchcock used, the dolly zoom effect, the pull zoom effect, particularly in the film Vertigo, where the floor appears to be dropping away. So I thought, well, I can start adding that in there. And as soon as I realized I had control over the visual input into somebody's head, whilst they were feeling these oscillating forces, I realized I had a very powerful tool to be able to make people feel something very particular. So 4 years ago, I created an installation called VR Playground, which is now toured North America, Korea, around Europe. And it's a series of 8 swings which we pop up at outdoor arts festivals. And the piece of work that I created was a study of the different types of movement we could make people believe that they were sensing when they were on a swing. So again, we've got playground equipment or kind of fairground equipment, and trying to elicit a response in an audience. Now, the 3 pieces of work which I'm going to show you, they're not just making people believe that they're swinging higher. Some of them are making people feel that they're like a jellyfish undulating through the sea. Another one makes some people feel like they're walking like a robot through a town. Another one made people feel like they were bouncing over rooftops. And I'll just show you a little bit of that work. Now, the thing I love about that work is also it's very similar to what the Butler saw type of sideshows. And in fact, that was originally called the kinematic scope, which was developed by Edison originally to illustrate his light bulbs. using film footage. And this idea that people are having an emotional experience, but people outside watching don't know what they're seeing, and they can see somebody screaming on a playground swing. Clearly, most people don't usually scream on a playground swing, and so the queue starts to form. And then we realize, once the queue starts forming, then we can start to charge people. And so this idea of entrepreneurship and showmanship and working with an audience and creating this I suppose, demand to consume experience starts. This was another engineering structure, a new swing that I was commissioned to make for the City of London Corporation a couple of years ago to mark the 500th anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci. And this set of swings, I created 4 experiences you could ride, which all simulated different flying machines of Leonardo da Vinci. So there was an ornithopter, the helical screw, there was a parachute, and this one here is the ornithopter experience. So as you're swinging, going backwards and forwards, feels like you're flapping your wings. So getting that timing of the effort you're putting into the swing and the sensation of swooping and going up into the air are perfectly timed. So people, as they're putting energy into the swing, they get this real sense of embodiment in the movement. And all this work is to do with having an embodied experience within these fantastical virtual worlds. The logical progression of this work, I thought at the time, was to line it more with the language of seasides and fairgrounds. And so I started to develop concepts for swing boats, where 2 people could interact in these virtual worlds next to each other. I visited Margate, obviously just down the coast, started talking to Dreamland and developing ideas of work that we could create for their centenary. But whilst I was in Dreamland looking at their swing boats, I came across this ride. This is a Scrambler Ride, which is, this particular one here is made by Ellie Bridge in the United States. And the thing about the Scrambler, which I remember, was that it's a ride that, in fact, I'll describe its engineering principles in a bit, but essentially it also undulates like a swing, squeezes you into the outside of the ride, pings you flying across to the other side, then you're crushed into your seat again and backwards and forwards. And they have this regular beating pattern. You feel these forces in your body. And I just fell in love, and I thought, I really must work with this machine. I'd first come across this machine and started working with it back in 2002 for a project that had been commissioned by the Wellcome Trust. It was a SciArt project, and this actually, the film was taken from a fairground that I visited in Leighton, in the East End of London. Now, that particular project I made working with a scientist called James Condren from MIT. I made a machine called the Auto Portrait Machine, which monitored sweat levels in people's fingers, and as people become more excited, the autonomic nervous system kicks in, the pores in the skin open up, the electrical conductivity increases rapidly, and I was using that to fire a camera, single-shot film camera, which was taking a portrait of the rider's face as they were on the ride. So this was an artistic project, and the output was a series of photographic portraits. So the images ranged from kind of expressions of mania, delight, and blissfulness, sort of otherworldliness. And so these images have been exhibited quite widely and really underpin a lot of my practice, both as an artist and as an engineer, as a technologist, as a scientist. In fact, it's probably a good time to say, because obviously there's a question in the audience about my history. So I was originally trained as an aeronautical engineer and worked at British Aerospace. and studied at Imperial College. That was about 5 years. But I love the picture on the right. This was a ride, the Dive Bombers, which was designed by the Ailey brothers in the US. And this ride started to appear early part of the 20th century. They had been designed, these pieces of apparatus, as to train First World War pilots. This idea of tumbling and doing loop-the-loops and inverted turns. And it was all to do with training the vestibular system. But during the Great Depression, the Ailey brothers quickly transferred their knowledge and skills into the entertainment industry. And these rides were staple on the fairground scene for many decades. So the idea of technology, opportunity, cultural and social history, all and commerce, all are, in my mind, interrelated. And this was the patent of the first twister ride, which Richard Harris had patented back in 1940. Here we go, the one, 1941. That's right, because this year it celebrated its 80th anniversary as a patent, as a piece of ride equipment. Now, as you can see here, these patterns are the things that really intrigue me. These are the kind of patterns that a body will describe when they're flying around. And that's because we've got circles on the outside, a central spindle, 3 arms, and then at the end of each arm, another spindle with another set of arms. And at the end of each of those arms are the riders. And so they're spinning one way, and the ride's going the opposite way, and you sort of describe these kind of spirographic shapes depending on the gear relationships between those spindles. In fact, actually, I'm trying to think which ones become most popular. I think this one here is probably, most of the rides are based on this gear ratio here now, because that just feels really nice. If you've been on a twister, you know when it feels right. So I was working with Dreamland initially, but during lockdown, I started working with Brighton Palace Pier. And this year, this summer, I opened my own ride on Brighton Palace Pier. So if anybody's down there, if you go to the end of the pier, find their twister, in fact, that's where we are, end of Brighton Palace Pier, I've created a virtual reality experience which you can ride. So this artwork you can ride whilst riding the twister. So you find our stall down there, get a headset, and once you're on the ride, what you'll experience, this first piece of artwork, the VR twister, it makes you feel as though, because there's actually a slight slope on the twister. When you get to the backside, your back's been thrown out. In the virtual world, you feel like you're being thrown up in the air, backwards and forwards. And then the sensation of moving forwards and backwards, a little bit like somebody on a bit of elastic, throwing somebody backwards and forwards. You start zooming forwards through this very colourful, abstract, architectural space. And we do make people scream, which is nice. So we're going to be open there all the way up until the end of the half term. So until the 31st of October, weekends, and then that half-term holiday. So if you're down, please visit. But the other ride, which also caught my attention at Dreamland, which I was talking to them about, was their scenic railway, which obviously had been renovated quite recently and was a big deal. But then, I found this picture of the switchback, which had been at Folkestone. And I think actually in one local historian's account was, I think they sort of describe it as being rather gauche and not really fitting for Folkestone, having such a ride there. And, opinions out, but in my mind, looking at that and knowing the scenery that's off to the side, it would have been a spectacular ride. And the reason roller coasters, not just because it's a scenic railway, we can see things whilst having this very pleasurable sensation. The reason that roller coasters excite me so much is because of their relationship to our the way we sense the world, the way we experience emotions. And even just looking at this diagram of the human inner ear, the semicircular canals, the otoliths, which detect rotation about X, Y, and Z, and movement about X, Y, and Z, and compare it to, well, this is a Cobra Roll, which is quite an iconic type of inverting curve on roller coasters designed by Werner Stengel, who's probably the grandfather of roller coasters. It excites every single part of the vestibular system. You can imagine that ear just rolling around in there. And if you get it right, not only does it physically excite you, it feels pleasurable. And when you get arousal and pleasure together, you get thrill. And that, for me, is the most valuable commodity as a ride designer. So, other part of my work is surveying rides, helping people like Alton Towers. This was an experiment I conducted on Oblivion, which was the world's first vertical drop roller coaster, monitoring people's physiological states whilst being on a roller coaster, looking at their facial expressions, looking at how their heart rate, their breathing, their sweat levels change on the rides. And that's sometimes it's to help market their rides and to, I think we say, to amplify the experience, because sometimes as a spectator you don't know what people are feeling on rides. So to reveal what's happening to the body is one way to talk about the value, the perceived value of a ride. But also there's economic value in understanding people's responses to rides. In fact, this ride on the left here is 13 at Alton Towers. And for every extra inch of steelwork, it costs tens of thousands of pounds. And at this particular point on the ride that's being portrayed here, the ride carriage pulls into a station. It's pitch black. People don't know what's going to happen, so you've been traveling horizontally. And then suddenly the entire ride carriage drops vertically straight down. And it's, it scares the bejesus out of everyone. But you could continue that drop down, and at some point there are going to be diminishing returns. You've kind of had your excitement in the first few. Well, that's the question they asked me. How far do we need to drop people in the dark for it to be both valuable, everybody to have an experience, but not to be wasting money on steel structure? And it turned out, I think, that the 95th percentile, about 95% of people who will go on this ride will experience a moment of, their brains will register what's happening after about 50 milliseconds, which equates to just over 9-meter drop. Anybody who knows this ride, a bit of a ride geek, is actually just around 7 meters, and we achieve that by giving it a little initial drop first, which pump primes the brain. But I could go more into that, but you see the relationship there between the engineering, the cost, the experience. So, quite naturally, I was thinking, well, how high is the funicular in Folkestone? And how fast could people be dropped? I actually looked at an ordnance survey map, and we got, because there are various accounts of what the drop is on the funicular, and it's about 28 meters from what I can determine. Now, the two commodities any roller coaster or ride designer will look at, you can think of rides in terms of energy. So potential energy, which is the mass of, let's say, the person, the rider, gravity, and height. So that those multiplied together, basically it means if you go to the top of a hill, you've got energy to do something. And the other side is, the thing you can do with it is, if I was to drop a ball from 28 meters down, we can turn all of that height into kinetic energy, which is half mv squared. And so just a rough calculation that we drop a person from 28 meters, we can get up to about 50 miles an hour by the time we get to sea level, which I'd say, thank goodness, there's a brake system on the funicular right now, but it could be quite exciting. So I look at this and I think, we've got a lot of potential energy in Folkestone. We have these, it's a town of 2 layers. And this, so again, when I'm thinking, bringing my own practice to thinking about Folkestone as a place for creating, consuming entertainment and emotional experience, already I'm seeing, literally seeing potential in Folkestone. So the history of using potential energy in England, and I know we could go into ice slides in Russia, etc., but in England, it's very much based in industry. This particular set of pictures aren't from Folkestone, they're from Yorkshire, from Shipley Glen, not far from where I was originally born and brought up. On the right-hand side here is Shipley's tramway. Because it was a hilly environment, they had to have a brakeman to stop the cart running away downhill. There's obviously a horse just off screen here. But because they started using the industrial tramways from the mines to transport people at weekends, and this was quite usual, that weekday work environments might be used for pleasure at weekends, another entrepreneur opened the toboggan slide using exactly the same drop in a different part of the hill, and just made purpose-built little carriages that you could fly down. And this guy at the bottom here was the brakeman who would slow people down. But the toboggan slide was closed down because the brakeman's technology failed once, and there were deaths at Shipley Glen. Tragic. But for me, the relationship between tragedy and danger and fear and pleasure and thrill and arousal, they're all parts, the potential of danger, playing at the dangerous edge, novelty, all wrap into a very similar set of emotions. And in fact, in East End of London, in Faden Boys, there were, at the weekends, at the end of the train lines, there were these tea houses which were in the middle of Epping Forest. And there were these fairgrounds in the middle of Epping Forest that grew up in the interwar period, and people would go out at the weekends and play on these. But this particular fairground, in fact, here you can see the Helter Skelter, was blown up by an aerial mine in the Second World War. And in fact, only a mile or two away, in 1999, a Korean airplane, 747, crashed, cargo plane crashed in Epping Forest. And it was something about this location and these two different types of emotions which are being played out in this area really intrigued me. And that piece of work became a ride with a theatre company called Shunt in London, where we created an aircraft cabin, and there was a flight ground staff, and then it was actually a zip wire where you flew into very bright lights, and then you could take a photograph of your survival photographs at the end. But playing with this mixture of tragedy and pleasure and delight. But jumping back to Folkestone, we have, compared to Shipley Glen, we have, you may be familiar with the toast rack, the tram that was that trundled around the area. And again, there was a brakeman because of lots of hills around Folkestone. It was called the toast rack because everybody sat in rows. And then what I see, a little bit like Shipley, the commodification then of that, the formalization of this day tripping into something which was dedicated as a ride with this beautiful scenery looking out to sea and having these trees in your left-hand vision whipping past really fast. On your right-hand side, you see this vast open space. And that kind of visual stimulation and the use of nature and natural woods as well really excites me. In fact, this just the going back to Shipley Glen, I actually found this Pathé footage. This was a tramway in a mine, which this is genuine footage of these guys commuting back home from work. Somebody designed these little skateboards and little wheels on the side. And these guys, look how many people are coming out of the mine and just coming home down this thing. I mean, it's obvious. You can see the relationship between people going, actually, this is good fun. Why don't we do this as entertainment? And this is clearly where roller coasters started to evolve. And so another coastal site, Coney Island, this loop, the loop ride, in fact, this was the world's first looping ride, appeared at the turn of the 20th century. And it was really successful, but it had one feature which was very unexpected, that as you come down this steep slope and all your potential energy is converted right at the bottom to the maximum amount of velocity, you then flip into this loop. And we're creating centripetal force. So essentially, that velocity is then, when it's thrown to the outside of this circle, we get a force which, hopefully, when we get to the top, you're still going fast enough that the centripetal force is going to be making the car stick to the rails so you don't go dropping out of the curve. But it was this transition here between the straight run and this curve was so dramatic, it could create G-forces over 10G. Now, the body, you know, when you're designing roller coasters today, you want to kind of keep them within 3.5, 4G and not for too long. So they had nurses permanently stationed in this Sea Sound Fairground ride, dealing with whiplash injuries. Now, luckily we had people like John Miller, who I think he's got something like 110 patents still in existence today on modern roller coasters. But one of his most important ones was this thing called the understop wheel here, which basically meant if you weren't going fast enough around that curve, you're not going to drop out because you've got another set of wheels keeping the car upside down. So you don't need to go quite so fast, and you're not going to get whiplash, which is great. Now, these kind of, I think that exploration, you know, the more I talk to people, I've worked in TV as well as rides, and I was approached by ITV for a game show called It's Not Rocket Science, actually, and they said, could I design the world's first fully inverting playground slide, which had no safety nets, only used centripetal force to keep the rider stuck on the inside of the loop. And there are rides that exist which are tubes, which if you fell out, you'd only just go into the tube and come out. But this had to be completely open. And they said, could you do it? And typically, you know, we need it in 2 months' time. So working with an engineering firm, applying exactly the same calculations of potential energy at the top. Obviously, it's more complex. We have friction, we have temperature difference, material science all going into this. But critically, it's the shape of this curve here. Now, if it were the looping coaster that we saw at Coney Island, it would be a perfect circle. But actually, if we look to Werner Stengel, he started designing these called Clothoid Loops, and you'll see more of these on roller coasters, these kind of teardrop shapes. And all that it means is that as you come down, shooting down here, the very first change in direction is a very large radius. So the centripetal force is quite low. And as you start to climb, you start to gain potential energy, you lose kinetic energy, that's your velocity again. And before you drop out the curve, just make it tighter so you quickly whip round the top and then back out in a smooth curve again. So again, this innovation and these shapes, which are so iconic to these rides, were fascinating to me. And, well, was I able to do it? Well, let's have a little look. Yeah. So that was, yes, very good. We have some shots of dummies falling out and being obliterated, but this is our first human flight down there. So let's see if I can just click forwards. Now, the slide there was a mixture of aluminium and steel structure. I was invited by the Museum of Sex in New York, a very respectable museum, I have to add, to create a slide for their museum on 5th Street on Manhattan Island. Now, I visited a company called Vegan, who made, obviously, God, now I can't remember the artist's name, can I? You know. the slide? Carston Holler, there we go. That was it. Thanks. I knew if I just stared at you, it'd come to me, Leave, you know. He made Carston Holler's slide, and the slide from the museum, I was quite interested in changing the slide's textures. As you can see, the idea behind this. But the real intrigue for me, visiting manufacturing plants, was that I got to go to Germany to meet Martin Wiegand himself, and he showed me around his manufacturing, what they were able to do. And the very exciting thing was he showed me this ride. I'd never seen it before. It was called the Alpine Slide. Now, unlike a roller coaster, it's got very little technology in it at all. It runs on 2 metal rails. The rider has got his own brake, his or her brake, to slow themselves down or let themselves go faster. And again, you get this sense of amazing scenery. They're obviously seat belted in. And I actually went on one of these in my honeymoon 5 years ago in the Alps. And the way it weaves down through the mountainside is absolutely incredible and thrilling. But it's not scary. It's not designed to be a scary thrill ride. It's got amazing, pleasurable experiences and qualities about it. And of course, it reminded me when I saw the switchback at Folkestone of that scenery, that movement, which you know, again, I find so exciting. So, if I just go back to that, of course. So, the toboggan. The question here was obviously what goes down always has to go back up again. So there's power involved. You know, I'm thinking of making a ride. You know, you've got to think about the power requirements. It's not just all fun. There's work to be done getting people up there. And that took me obviously to the funicular, the Lees lift, and how that worked, and the balance of waterway, the water used to take passengers up and down. And I'll come back to this in a minute because I had a massive misconception about this funicular. And, you know, so delighted to see it in genuine fake at the golf course, to see it there portrayed. The other part of my brain starts to think about the number of people, because it's great, you can make a piece of work, 1 or 2 people see it, but actually the joy I get and as a creator is getting so many people to ride a ride I've created. But to do that, there's obviously economics involved. You can't just give things away for free. You have to sustain the business of creating these experiences. So I did a back of a A4 page set of calculations. So imagine we collectively, you're going to crowdfund me. I know after this I'm going to go around with my checkbook. You're hopefully you'll fund. That's a joke. I'm not coming around. So 2022, we all open up a ride in Folkestone. Let's say we're open for 6 weeks, 44 days. That's 6 times 7 plus the weekend at the end, to making 44 days. There are in the UK, we have to account for about 10% rain days where we can't operate at all. So we've got about 40 days operating in 2022. Now, if we operate 12 hours a day and we run 1 little car every 30 seconds, the maximum capacity we can get down is 1,440 cars a day. But I'm a bit of a realist as well, because if I ever went to something like that, you know, and said, can we actually make this ride? They say, you're never going to get full capacity. So we do a little bit of a calculation, looking at distribution of people over the day from when you open and close. Maybe we're lucky and reach maximum capacity in the middle of the day. We kind of like say, on a nice summer holiday, we might reach 35% maximum capacity a day, which is 500 cars a day going down our ride slope. Now, in each car, we've got a child. Let's say, actually, the riders in these cars can either have a single child, an adult, 2 children, or an adult and child. So we've got about an average of 80 kilograms in each car, and the cars weigh about 40 kilograms each. So we've got about 120 kilogram load coming down this ride slope. Now, if we're looking at the economics of this, we've also can say, well, let's say for argument's sake, 1 car, single occupancy is £5, and double occupancy, £7. So average £6 a car. Now, in a theme park, the way we would look at this would be, even over a summer, we've got a realistic chance of creating revenue of £120,000. But we multiply that by 3 because people who come will spend in other areas of the local economy, so souvenir, gift shops. They will also buy beverage and food. And so the economic value just in one summer to the local economy could be around £360,000. Now, if you look at the ecology of this ride, well, I say the power ecology, 500 cars a day, we've got to be moving 60,000 kilograms a day of people and goods up the side of this hill, over 28 meters and approximating gravity at 10 meters a second. We're going to be needing about just over 16 million watts, 16.8 megawatts a day. Or that's like if we put a 3-bar heater on, 24 hours a day, we'll be running about 233 electric heaters, full power a day. That's how much power we're going to be eating on this ride. I thought, this is my misconception, I thought the funicular, when it was powered by water, I thought there was a natural power source up here. I thought there was a natural riverway where we were getting the water into this top carriage, which was then counterbalancing the lower one, and obviously the water was released at the bottom, lowering the weight, and this whole system would bounce backwards and forwards with the filling, dumping, and refilling of these carriages. It was partly right, but I didn't realize that the water was actually collected at the bottom and pumped back up to the top. So in a way, it was using energy to pump exactly the same, well, you could say the same weight of water, but actually the water was only required to just counterbalance the number of riders who were inside each of these carriages. But I was really disappointed. I thought I was going to be able to tell you you're going to have the first ecologically sound ride for Folkestone. But all was not lost. Well, it was about 8 o'clock last night, I'm thinking, what am I going to say to everybody? But I found this ride here. I thought there's got to be another funicular that's based on water, from a natural source of water. And there is another fairly natural source of water. This funicular in Freiburg in Germany, or Freiburg in Germany, is powered by sewage. The community at the top produces their sewage, which is loaded into these carriages, which powers it to the bottom, and then it's released into the public sewage system. This has been operating for about 120 years, faultlessly. So I was thinking, for Folkestone, it just turns out that if I go back to my calculations, an average household produces 350 litres of sewage, wastewater, sewage, a day. So that's about 350 kilograms a day. Now, for the amount of transference we need a day, we only need about 171 homes a day to move 60,000, that's 60 tons of goods a day back up to the top. We need the sewage of 171 homes. Now, I found that I think we've got ample source up here, haven't we, for people to produce. The thing I found today was there is a sewage processing plant at sea level embedded into the cliffs. So for me, leaving it there, there's, as the starting point of a potential project, I still think, historically, Folkestone has been the home to some quite amazing sites of entertainment, industry, innovation, business. But there's still heaps of potential still in there, literally waiting to be untapped. It might not be the sewage, but it's here. And I think it's an incredibly exciting place to come and visit right now and see the Triennial. Thank you. I think Lee's going to... Oh, you're getting a Madonna mic. Sorry, I realised this really, I ran on maybe 10, 15 minutes, but I think Lee's going to ask us.
I think it's on. I'm just going to open it up to you guys. really, if you have any questions for Brendan, in particular about calculations. No, I'm joking. If you have any kind of particular questions about roller coasters, the switchback, anything that you'd actually like to ask, hands up, and I'm going to give the mic to Ollie. For me, in particular, there was a Triennial artwork in the Lees lift, 2011, which was a sound work, which I think you did experience when you have been here before. In terms of, if we were going to calculate the Lees lift back into business, because we walked past it today because the braking system's gone. So was it just 171 houses needed?
for the
Lees lift in particular?
Yes, I mean, I think the Lees lift, if it were revisited, because obviously at the time, it wasn't just a means of transportation between the upper and lower, and it was meant to be a slow, scenic view over the bay. So, you know, I've experienced it, and I've seen other people experience it as a, quite rightly, as a industrial heritage, technological feat, historical endeavour, innovation of its time. But I still think a little bit like I've worked with people at London Eye trying to reimagine the pods. And it's got the grandeur, the capacity, the vista, the movement. It's got all the qualities of the London Eye. And I think, I mean, if we're talking about reimagining without, while still celebrating that technology, I think there are things that could be done. I could imagine a few, but we don't want, you would never want to compete. You'd want something that complemented that technology rather than competed with it. So I've seen it done, and I think that would be I think if you can make the proposition more to bring back to life that wonder and awe of that vista, as well as being in the moving machine, I think then the money will follow. I'm not saying it's not a good ride already, but I think that's, I understand it's a really difficult proposition to keep anything like industrial heritage alive and going, because things that move, particularly at the seaside, I know the rides at Brighton, they get rusty. They have to be operated all the time. They're constantly breaking down. It's a terrible environment to have engineering. It's a big feat, but I think things could be done in there, and it would be a really interesting space for artists to be let loose. Give it to me. No, not me, but.
Hi, that was really interesting. I really enjoyed that, and I think your passion for thrill really comes across, which was great. I have kind of two questions, I guess. I wanted to ask if you've experienced the virtual reality artwork that's part of the Triennial this year, and if you have, what are your thoughts about it? And then, as going back to roller coasters question, I'd just be intrigued to hear what's the very first thing that you think about when you set out with designing or being part of the design of a roller coaster?
Okay. So the VR here, I was really disappointed that the library's closed on a Wednesday. So I think we'll have to come back down for that. But I have been talking to Eve about what it entails, not only operationally, but also experientially. So I know a little bit about the story of what's been told there. I mean, from the very first times I presented VR work at Sheffield Dockfest, and I think there was a film, Clouds Over, wasn't Clouds Over Syria, Clouds Over Sidda. The viewer was put in the position of as an observer in a refugee camp, and this ability of virtual reality to, what I think, to not only to create visual illusion, but to tap into, I think, into a kind of a dream space in the mind. We're very, so basically they're described as being emotion engines, these emotion machines, VR. So the power that VR has to create impact is quite massive. So I think the piece of work there I'd really like to see. The question of roller coasters and where would one start? If I was designing it, I would start with always with the emotional journey. So a little bit like, you know, look at the musical compositions of John Carpenter and the notations and that trajectory of emotions, or a choreographer over time, looking at 5-act structures of plays, but thinking about emotions in that way, and then start to build backwards to say, well, how can we start to create these moments of conflict and resolution and excitement and relief and tension. So that's the way I'd start to think about it. If you go to somebody like Merlin and say the Wicker Man there, the very first meeting we had was there were the marketeers, there were advertisers in the room, and then there were the ride designers. One of the very first questions was, you know, what IP can we associate with this? So it's kind of like, is this going to be the Thomas the Tank ride? You know, and they start off with that going, right, what are Thomas's brand values? And that for me, I'm going, it isn't the right place to start, but it is if you need to make it economically viable. And the marketeers do have their hands on the purse strings. So, yeah, so I think quite typically I will be brought into consultancy at that point to mix things up and suggest other starting points, but it can be hard.
Hi. Fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. In thrill science, as you're sort of identifying and isolating different sensations, what interest is there from things like academic neuropsychology and neuroscience in that work that you're doing? And then conversely, does thrill engineering ever take from neuropsychology, neuroscience, and studies of emotions and put that into the design or sort of conception process?
So for many years, I originally started my research, as Liv said, I'm a Professor of Creative Industries at Middlesex University. I started out at the Royal College of Art when my interests were very much to do with designing and creating and performing emotional experience. And I think it was whilst I was there, the relationship between, so looking at human emotions and these elements of, at that point it was mainly physiology, so looking at how the body responded, how the face responded, how our muscles all to some degree tell us, communicate the emotions that we're feeling, because we're all animals. We're built to communicate with other animals. You look back at Charles Darwin, his work with emotions of animals and humans. So that physiological exploration, which obviously that experiment on the twister using the galvanic skin response, really created this formula, which I didn't show, but there was a formula for thrill, which I got quite well known for, and it was quite audacious in a way, saying that we could monitor the levels of thrill. Before, it had always been quite abstract, the thrill level. But I started to quantify it, and it was all based on, arousal and valence. So I either thought, at that point, I could either go down a biochemical route, looking at dopamine, adrenaline, endorphins, and looking at the biochemistry. That's kind of fascinating. But also, if you're thinking about rides and entertainment, anything that starts to become invasive as far as monitoring people. If you want it as part of the experience, difficult. But if you want to study a ride, for example, to survey a ride, that's when I started to think about using slightly more medical grade equipment, but also we have done some work with neurology. And so I moved to the Department of Computer Science at University of Nottingham, so I partnered with them for many years, looking at collecting multiple streams of data from physiology and neurology, and more recently working with Middlesex University. But to answer your question, we found the use of any data, whether it's neurological, physiological, they are great tools for reflecting. So is the experience, let's say it's a roller coaster, is it performing how the designer had intended? And if not, so it gives us another lens to look on that ride and to analyze that ride. It has never yet, to my mind, been able to be the starting point. So I think it can be invaluable because eking out another few % of efficiency, and sometimes I talk about roller coasters as machines that can produce emotional experience, much like a car can produce motion from potential energy contained in fossil fuels. They're about 20% efficient. The best roller coasters, we've determined, are around 20% efficient as well. You can't be thrilled all the time. But as we know in the automotive industry, squeezing out an extra 0.1% of performance is massively valuable. So techniques like neurology, I have to say, we've used neurology to illustrate, but my knowledge of neurology as a, let's say, design tool is limited, but we've been using 14-channel. You probably come from, do you come from a neurological background? No. So we use quite low-grade monitoring headsets to look at brain activity. Most people would use like hundreds of channels to look at all sorts. So we're quite crude, but sometimes when you're designing, you only need crude tools to give you an insight to spark another idea and move off. We're not looking to make deep academic studies of these things. We're looking for those creative sparks, those moments of innovation, finding things that are truly new that will cause lateral thinking across to somewhere else, and that's what we're always looking for. A long-winded way of saying yes. Okay.
Just reminded me, when you described you just reminded me, when you described the ride where the car drops, you mentioned a priming technique. Could you explain that?
A bit more about that.
Yeah.
So there was, so that came from, so we knew that the data I got for that particular study, I said to Alton Towers, I want to build a rig, I want to test like 100 people, I want to measure the physiology, I want to see how far. And they said, we haven't got the budget for that, and we need to know in 2 days' time. Because actually they wanted to release a story about how high this thing was going to be. So it was all very complex. So I had to go to DLV, the driving agency, DLA, to look at the studies they'd done on passenger safety and looking at the response times of humans who were driving, who saw or sensed something dangerous and were able to form a physical action. So essentially, see a woman step out with a pram, apply the brakes. And that kind of time it took to process. And in my analogy, it was how long did it take for somebody to process the information enough to formulate the response of grabbing hold of the handrails. And for me, that's where the 50 milliseconds came from. Now, that had translated into the distance. But I'd heard, and I'd known that that Hitchcock had used techniques to do with what I call pump priming, which was to do something which was supposed to be scary, and turns out there's sort of catharsis and release, and then actually something really horrific happens just moments later. And there's a certain way of, I suppose you might call it programming of the brain to prepare for certain eventualities. And we found some published academic data about the repeated exposure to stimuli. So the first time it's novel, you've no idea it's going to happen. If you feel this first, and what we decided to do was we dropped people 2 inches to start with. So for a split second, people felt the sense of weightlessness, and then oh God, it wasn't. Oh, then we're off down. And so we realized that, I can't remember how much in milliseconds it shaved off by pump priming, but that reduced into a faster response time and a smaller drop that was required. So it's, yeah, it was all about using those. And again, a lot of those kind of techniques are used in fun houses and other things with kind of floors that give you that sort of like, you know, those little sensations. So yeah, it was building on those techniques.
There's no other questions, and I would like to say thank you very much for Brendan joining us as talk number 3.
Oh.
And if everyone would like to give you a round of applause.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Lee. Cheers.